Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Russia and Ukraine agreed to swap 1,000 prisoners of war as initial peace talks conclude in Istanbul. Local medics say at least 93 people have been killed in Gaza after Israeli airstrikes. And a man charged with arson on properties linked to the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer appears in court. To our top story, and much anticipated talks between Russia and Ukraine have taken place in Istanbul today. It is the first direct meeting between the two warring nations in 3 years. According to a Ukrainian source, Russia has made what they call unrealistic demands which go far beyond anything ever discussed, including the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Russian territory and for a ceasefire to be implemented. They did, however, agree to swap 1,000 prisoners of war between the two countries. We can now go live to Istanbul to speak to our correspondent Ross Cullen. Ross, great to have you on the show. So today's talks were a step forward, but has there been any breakthrough between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, Leigh-Ann, certainly the headline announcement to come out of that meeting was the agreement to swap 1,000 prisoners of war each. And if that exchange goes ahead, it would be the biggest such exchange since the beginning of the war. Now, the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, who was mediating between Russia and Ukraine, said that it was an important day for world peace. He said the prisoner exchange that was announced was a confidence-building measure and that the two sides had agreed in principle to meet again. Just having this was symbolic. They haven't sat down in the same room, the Russian delegation and the Ukrainian delegation, since spring 2022. Incidentally, their last talks in person were here in Turkey as well. And it took a couple of days. There were delays. There was uncertainty about potentially the level of the delegation. Eventually, we found out that Russia said it would be sending a more junior delegation. And then we had a reaction from Ukraine as well to have a representation headed by the defense secretary. It wasn't a presidential level as Volodymyr Zelenskyy wanted. It wasn't even at foreign minister level. This was a more lower level, technical exchange. It didn't even last 2 hours, the meeting, but the fact that it has taken place certainly was seen as a positive sign by the hosts, Turkey, that they could potentially have more talks further down the line. But overall, the headline was the swapping of 1,000 prisoners, not what Ukraine wanted, which was Russia signing up to an immediate ceasefire.
So, Ross, that brings me on to my next question. Zelenskyy says Ukraine's #1 priority for today's talks was this unconditional ceasefire, as you just mentioned. Are we hearing more about Russia's priorities going forward?
Yeah, the lead negotiator for the Russian delegation, Leigh-Ann, was Vladimir Medinsky. He was also the negotiator last time they met in 2022, and he gave some comments to the press after the conclusion of those talks here in Istanbul. He said that overall, he was feeling generally satisfied with how the conversations had gone this afternoon. He said that Moscow had taken note of a request from Ukraine for a meeting to be scheduled between Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Vladimir Putin. Now, you might remember that's something that the Ukrainian president wanted to see here in Turkey. He said he would be waiting for President Putin here in Turkey, and eventually the Russian leader decided not to come. Overall, the Russians did also say that they had agreed to provide more details in terms of their visions of a ceasefire and to provide those proposals to Ukraine.
And Ross, while this was going on, European leaders were meeting and Keir Starmer basically said they must put more pressure on Russia if Putin doesn't agree to continue these negotiations and come to the table. How are European leaders planning to actually ratchet up pressure on Russia?
Yeah, that's right. So there was a meeting of the European political community today in Albania. That is a group that pretty much comprises every country in Europe. It's not just those who are in the European Union. And British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron and the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz were among those who were gathering in Albania, along with the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Volodymyr Zelenskyy. And they had a call after the conclusion of the talks here in Istanbul with Donald Trump to put forward their vision to the US president that they found it, quote, completely unacceptable that Russia's position was still not to sign up to a ceasefire. The idea of a ceasefire has been agreed by the United States, by Europe, by China, by Turkey, of course by Ukraine as well. So it is just Russia, they say, that is the blockage in this regard, that it won't sign up to a halt in the fighting. They have threatened to impose massive sanctions on Russia. They said that they will be closely aligning their position in the coming days, whether there could potentially be a trade embargo perhaps, or as the US Senator Lindsey Graham suggested, 500% sanctions imposed on Russian exports. Also, we can call to mind what the French foreign minister has said in this regard. He said that it could be time to try to suffocate the Russian economy once and for all with devastating sanctions. Leigh-Ann?
Ross Cullen in Istanbul, thank you for joining us. We can now go live to Moscow to speak to political analyst Andrei Anticov. Andrei, thank you so much for joining me. I was just wondering if you could react there to what our reporter Ross was saying about Russia not agreeing to a ceasefire despite other countries signing one.
That's right. Ukraine insists on an unconditional ceasefire, and that's absolutely unacceptable for Russia, because a ceasefire must be a result of negotiations. We have to understand the conditions of this ceasefire, and I think that when we talk about the ceasefire, it means that all military actions, all the military activities must be stopped in Ukraine. And you know that, for example, French President Macron says that this ceasefire doesn't mean that the supplement with the weapons must be stopped. Supplement Ukraine with the weapons must be stopped. So I think what Ukraine needs is a little break, this 30-day break, to get more soldiers, to get more weapons. And after that, Ukraine and its allies in Europe want to continue the fight. Of course, it's absolutely unacceptable for Russia. So, as I mentioned previously, all the military activities must be stopped. We have to also discuss the observer mission and so on and so on.
Okay, Andrei, negotiators from Russia and Ukraine have held talks in Istanbul, the first in 3 years. Ukraine has deemed Russia's newly introduced demands unacceptable and detached from reality. What do you make of this assessment? Other countries, including Ukraine, say they have gone to Turkey. They are ready for these ceasefire negotiations. They want a 30-day ceasefire. Putin was a no-show. New demands are coming in from Russia. What's happening?
I think the best result that these negotiations have started. It's really a good result for today. The second result is that there is exchange of prisoners. 1,000 Russian boys will come back home. 1,000 Russian soldiers will be back. That's a good result. And the third result, as I think, is that Russia and Ukraine have agreed to continue the dialogue. Of course, it was difficult to expect more results. It was difficult to expect that that Russia and Ukraine would agree on everything. The dialogue have just started, and I think we should see more negotiations in the coming weeks or even months, maybe. So I think we'll see some compromises.
The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his Turkish counterpart have both reiterated the need for a ceasefire. Is Russia ignoring these urgent calls from the US and their counterparts to stop the killing? Because you just said to me it's a positive step to have these talks that we are now seeing in Turkey between Ukraine and Russia, but the reality is on the battlefield, people are still dying.
That's right. That's correct. I don't mean that Russia is against the ceasefire, but as I mentioned previously, when we talk about ceasefire, all the military activities must be stopped. We don't want that Ukraine would use this chance, would use this ceasefire to supply its army with more weapons, to get more soldiers from the streets, and then to continue the fight after this ceasefire. We need a stable peace. We need a ceasefire that will transfer us to a peace agreement, to a real peace.
And Donald Trump says he wants to meet Putin as soon as we can. Do you think Putin is prepared to meet the US president? And is he interested in genuine diplomacy?
Of course, it's an interesting proposal, and we all expect this meeting between President Putin and President Trump, because anyway, the possible agreement between Russia and the United States is a key to solve this crisis, the Ukrainian crisis. The important thing is that this meeting will exclude President Zelenskyy. And when Mark Rubio says about the meeting, he mentions Putin, he mentions Trump, but he doesn't mention Zelenskyy. That's an important thing to my mind.
But Zelenskyy is a key player in this. You know, he's the person who's frustrated, and right now his country's also being attacked by Russia. So why shouldn't he be included in these, do you think?
I think he can be included in negotiations after the final text will be agreed between the delegations, between the negotiators. Then we will see the meeting. I think that we will see the meeting between two presidents, President of Russia, President of Ukraine, to sign this agreement. And that's all. But when we talk about Zelenskyy, Zelenskyy is not is a figure who has consultations with many countries, with European countries. So I think we should talk with countries that take real decisions. First of all, it's the United States.
Andrei Anticov, a Russian political analyst, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you so much. Let's head over to Kyiv now to speak to Ivan Urs, Chief Consultant of the Center of Foreign Research at the National Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for joining me. Ivan, I don't know if you just want to react to my previous guest who said that President Donald Trump should be meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, but Zelenskyy should not be included in those talks.
Greetings to you, Leigh-Ann, and greetings to all audience. You know, I think that Russia demonstrates the classical imperial point of view. Russia watched to this world from the position that there is Russia, there is the United States, there is China, and that's all. There is no other countries. That's why for President Putin, he said that he don't ready to meet with President Zelenskyy because whole world except US and China is not exist. And from that point of view, from that perspective, of course, it's logically to hear that statement. But for more than 3 years, Russia in full-scale war with Ukraine. If Russia were in war with the United States, of course, President Putin should talk with Donald Trump. But they not have a war with the United States. They're in war with Russia. And even if President Putin and President Trump have some agreement, the Ukrainian soldiers is not subordinated to Donald Trump. They're subordinated to Ukrainian president and Ukrainian people. So that's why that Russian imperial approach, I think it's failed, because time of empires go to the history more than a century ago. Unfortunately, Russia still want to see themselves as an empire. That's why when Russia like to say that they want to eliminate the reason of this war, you know, I agree, because as former advisor of the US President, Jasinski, security advisor, once said a phrase, without Ukraine, Russia is not empire. Without Tataria, Russia is just Moscovia. Russia want to be empire, that's why they want to control Ukraine. If Russia not control Ukraine, they're not empire. They want to be empire, that's why we have the reason of this war. If Russia forgot about the imperialistic views, I think that peace will be. Thank you, Leigh-Ann.
Ivan, thank you so much for that. But I just want to say, on the topic of Donald Trump, Do you believe Donald Trump is the only person right now, the US president, who can actually bring a 30-day ceasefire to Ukraine and Russia and be able to get these peace talks that could eventually happen underway?
You know, Leigh-Ann, actually Donald Trump proposed 30 days ceasefire without any preconditions. Russia immediately started to say that we need preconditions, as today they said that we're preparing this list. But as for me, it's violation of proposition of Donald Trump. It's violation of the proposition of the leading European countries and Ukraine that made a joint proposition with those European countries and talked even today with Donald Trump from Albania, where our president now actually participate in some meetings. And that's why that approach that Russia don't need US proposal, don't need Donald Trump proposal, I think that it should motivate Donald Trump to make serious action. You know, your correspondent before the interview with Moscow guest, he said a little bit wrong phrase. He said about 500% tariffs on the Russia goods. It's not correct. The proposition of Lindsey Graham, 500% tariff for the products of the countries who are buying oil and gas from Russia. It's very important difference, because every country who are purchasing gas and oil from Russia should understand that in case of supporting this Lindsey Graham idea, their goods will face with 500% tariffs in the United States of America market. It's so-called non-direct sanctions, but it's, for me, one of the most serious because it can damage Russia economy. Russia economy, actually, when Russia like to say that, oh, everything perfect with our economy, I always say two figures. 3.2 trillion Russian rubles deficit of Russian budget after 4 months of this year. 3.3 trillions, it's the liquid part of their reserves. So it means that in the nearest vicinity, Russian reserves could not cover the deficit of their budget. And it can cause economic problems. That's why when someone asks Ukraine how you expect to win this war, I always expect economy can win this war. Because you can have a lot of tanks, but if you're not paying pensions to your pensioners and salaries in budgetary area, it's very hard to win the war. Germany in the First World War can demonstrate that fact that they were very successful on the front line, but they lose the economy, and that's why they lost First World War. The same situation can be with Russia. So no one attacked actually Soviet Union, but after deal between Saudi Arabia and the United States about decreasing global oil prices, that actually happened. After that, Soviet Union disappeared. That's why, who knows? Probably Saudi Arabia and Russia can repeat the same trick as they do in 1986, that borrow USSR, now they can borrow Russia. Thank you, Leigh-Ann.
Ivan Us, Chief Consultant of the Centre of Foreign Research at the National Institute for Strategic Studies. I appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leigh-Ann.
Thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Etihad has ordered 28 wide-body Boeing aircrafts with GE engines in a $200 billion deal between the US and the UAE. The Abu Dhabi-based airline confirmed the jets were expected to join the existing fleet in 2028. The White House said the deal deepened the long-standing aviation partnership between the US and the UAE. Israel has qualified for the Eurovision Grand Final this weekend, hours after protesters disrupt dress rehearsals. 24-year-old Yuval Rafal was performing the song New Day Will Rise when 6 people with oversized Palestinian flags interrupted her act. Swiss broadcasters organising the event said the audience members were escorted from the arena. Fans attending the 2028 Olympic Games in Los Angeles could escape the city's traffic and fly to and from events. LA28 have announced a partnership with Archer Aviation to provide air taxi services during the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Flying taxis were due to debut at the Paris Games in 2024, but were not certified by Europe's Air Safety Agency in time. And footballer Cristiano Ronaldo has topped the Forbes list of the world's highest paid athletes for the third year in a row. Following his move to Al Nassr in Saudi Arabia, Ronaldo's estimated total earnings are around $275 million. The Portuguese forward's income also increased by $15 million with off-field endorsements and sponsorship deals. At least 93 people have been killed by Israeli strikes, according to local medics. The attacks took place in northern Gaza earlier this morning, with people fleeing from Beit Leah and as well as a Jabalia refugee camp. Associated Press say at least 66 bodies were taken to the Indonesian hospital. A doctor at the hospital has told NBC he believes at least 250 have been killed across Gaza in the past 36 hours. I'm now joined by Middle East correspondent and author Yotam Confino. Yotam, great to have you on the show. Deadly Israeli strikes have been pounding Gaza today, which follows a series of attacks yesterday. What is the situation on the ground?
Israel is pounding away, as you said. They targeted 150 different places in Gaza in the last 24 hours. Hitting both Jabalia and Beit Lahia in northern Gaza, but also Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. And in addition to the airstrikes, Israeli tanks are also advancing in all of those areas that I just mentioned. So the situation is, of course, getting more and more bloody in Gaza as the Israeli military is going further and further in to the Gaza Strip to try and capture some of the areas that Hamas are currently holding. Because every time Israel has been inside Gaza in certain areas and withdrawn from those areas, Hamas filled the vacuum very, very quickly. So Israel is now trying to prevent that from happening going forward, which is why Prime Minister Netanyahu said that there will be parts of Gaza that will be occupied. So we are seeing the beginning of a very bloody and aggressive assault from the Israeli military.
Yotam, Donald Trump has been in the Middle East on a 4-day tour and didn't visit Israel, but he's acknowledged people in Gaza are starving. Is there hope his comments could put pressure on Israel to lift this blockade?
There's no doubt that whatever Donald Trump says has an impact on Israel. Israel is listening to every word he says carefully, because Donald Trump is known to be quite unpredictable. He changes his mind very often. And it looks like he's quite fed up with the war in Gaza now. That's why he's been trying to really strong-arm Israel into making compromises so that there can be a comprehensive agreement, a ceasefire agreement with Hamas. And he's also told Israel in so many words that humanitarian aid has to enter Gaza. Now, there is a plan right now for Israel and for the United States to cooperate along with an NGO to get aid into Gaza. But the NGO, which is backed by the US, says that it will only be able to feed around 60% of people in Gaza because there are not enough distribution sites that Israel has approved in southern Gaza so far. But it really does look like we're finally going to see a lifting of the blockade with aid entering Gaza.
Yotam, we heard from Hamas yesterday, and we know from those comments they made that they are now in direct talks with the US. Is this a positive step forward to resuming ceasefire talks and possibly the release of more hostages?
I would say talks are always positive, and even if it's quite unprecedented for Israel, for the United States and for Hamas to have direct negotiations and talks, it's still, if you look at the broader scheme of things, if you want a deal to happen, it's always better to have people engaging. Now, Israel, of course, doesn't look at it that way. For Israel, it was better that the United States was standing on their side and Qatar was standing on Hamas's side, and that the negotiations went on the way in that manner. So I think Israel really feels like it's being sidelined now, that the United States are going over Israel's head to essentially negotiate a ceasefire on behalf of both Israel and Hamas. But at the end of the day, Israel has to agree to this, and I don't think that they will publicly object to Hamas and the United States talking to each other. But I think behind closed doors, they're probably trying to get Donald Trump and his people to stick with Israel and let Qatar deal with Hamas.
And Yotam, I know that you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I just wanted to expand on it because you were saying, you know, Israel might feel a little bit sidelined at the moment in some respects. But as you mentioned earlier, they are preparing to expand operations against Hamas. And they said they would do this when Donald Trump did leave the Middle East. Are we still expecting this to happen? And what could we see?
Absolutely. Israel has called up thousands of reservists who are now preparing to go into those areas in Gaza that I just mentioned, some of them at least. Some will go to the West Bank, others will go to the border with Lebanon. But Netanyahu's policy, his way of dealing with Hamas right now is basically to bomb them into submission. This is what he's hoping he can achieve. And we have to mention something quite significant that perhaps happened this week, which was Israel targeting the leader of Hamas inside Gaza, which was Mohammed Sinwar. And that was quite significant. We don't know if he's dead yet, but if he is, that's just another way for Israel to really punish Hamas as much as possible and to tell them that there's no way around agreeing to Israel's terms. If they don't, they will end up being killed one by one.
Yotam Confino, Middle East correspondent and author. Always good to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me. President Donald Trump has confirmed the US has provided Iran with an American proposal regarding its nuclear program. Negotiations between the two countries have been ongoing, with the two sides trying to reach a possible deal. Speaking to reporters on board Air Force One as it returns to Washington from the Middle East, the US president said things have moved quickly. Let's take a listen.
Has the U.S. given them a formal proposal? Has Steve Witkoff handed that over?
They have a proposal, but more importantly, they know they have to move quickly, or something bad's going to happen. Thank you very much.
How's Tiffany doing?
Let's get into this with Al Arabiya's geopolitical security analyst, Riyadh Kawaji. Riyadh, great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me. So we're talking about these US-Iran nuclear talks which are happening. What do we know about the US proposal to Iran, and when are we likely to possibly get a response at all?
In short, the proposal is this administration wants to undo the so-called sunset clause, where Iran would have the right for enrichment unlimited. Plus, just to get this problem out of the way completely, they're saying no enrichment, zero. I mean, this is basically the US proposal as clearly described by Mr. Witkoff after the last round, that no enrichment, zero enrichment, meaning this program will have to be based on uranium that will be enriched abroad. So Iran has a full cycle program, meaning it has from the point of excavating, mining the uranium, turning it into yellow cake, then processing for enrichment, then turning it into a fuel, so going through a whole fuel cycle. The US proposal is saying, no, the enrichment part should be out, because once a country has an enrichment, it can gradually or quickly reach the enrichment level to the 90%, which is military grade. So the US wants to get this possibility out of the way. Once the enrichment part is out, then there is no concern, no worry of Iran's program becoming nuclear anytime in the future.
But Riyadh, is Iran ever actually going to agree to that? Because we do know this is a major sticking point, and a lot of the time, no one really knows what grade Iran is enriching uranium at. That seems to be something that is a little bit difficult to find out.
Well, now we saw Iran taking some steps back. Iran now has agreed to give up all the stockpile of the highly enriched uranium, which is like up to 20% or 6% that it will export, send out all this, get rid of this stockpile. And it is willing to subject its program to heavy scrutiny, inspection, and so forth, and to commit to no militarization of its program. So we're seeing Iran now taking steps back. I think the US now is pushing to get the full non-processing part included within this. And they're using now sticks, not military. They're beginning to talk about more sanctions,
which could really affect the economy further in Iran. But President Trump's trip to the Middle East, Riyadh, this week has been seen as just a massive success. A lot of people have said that. And each stop he talked about not letting Iran obtain a nuclear bomb. How has this message gone down in the region as a whole?
Well, this has gone very positive because Iran has been a cause of a heightened threat perception in the region for several decades now. Ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, we saw Iran employ a very, some people would say, aggressive or intrusive policies through its proxies, developing the nuclear program, developing the ballistic missile program, and so forth. We saw the occasional incidents in the sea where ships were attacked. We saw the attack on the oil facilities in Saudis. We saw the armament for the Houthis and the attacks from Yemen. So a great deal of concern has been around Iran's policies and Iran's nuclear program. With all the discussions that happened and the agreements signed during the past 3 days, and the U.S. renewed security commitment to the region, and the U.S. role now in pushing forward this nuclear talks, this all comes to increase the stability of the region, and it's definitely a good news to the leaders of the region.
Trump has allegedly also threatened to strike Iran's program if a deal is not reached between the two countries. Israel has also threatened airstrikes. Are either of these actually a possibility, Riyadh?
The US and the West today have 3 sticks that they hold against Iran. The military is an option. So the US has already mobilized a lot of assets in the region. Israel is eager and even pressing the US to pursue the military option. Now, President Trump has decided to hold off on this option until they exhaust the diplomatic channels. The 2 other sticks, one is in the US hand, which is to enforce the zero export of oil from the Iranian side, meaning that they will be boarding oil tankers and preventing any movement of tankers carrying Iranian oil. And the 3rd stick is the snapback option, and this is a stick held by the European partners who are signatories to the agreement. We saw today a meeting in Istanbul between UK, France, Germany with their Iranian counterpart. It was on the level of deputy foreign ministers. They're talking about this. Iran is very concerned that the Europeans could invoke the snapback option will reinstate all the UN-imposed sanctions that were suspended in 2015 due to the agreement, the JCPOA. will be reinstated, and that will definitely be devastating to the Iranian economy.
Yes, Riyad Kawashi, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Al Arabiya's geopolitical security analyst. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A 21-year-old Ukrainian man has appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court in London today, charged with 3 counts of arson after fires at properties linked to the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Roman Lavronovich, a Ukrainian national living in London, is also charged with intent to endanger life. Emergency services had been called to 2 properties in North London, one of which Starmer previously lived with his family. We can now go live to London to speak to our correspondent, Ollie Barrett. Ollie, thank you so much for joining me. Tell us what went on in court today and talk us through the accusations.
Well, Leigh-Ann, this was a short court hearing at Westminster Magistrates Court. It lasted about 20 minutes. Roman Lavronovich speaking only to confirm his name, his date of birth and his address, and doing that with the help of an interpreter. We did have a little bit more detail in court from the prosecutor, who said that the defendant was charged with 3 offences of aggravated arson, and she set out the dates in May that these alleged offences were claimed to have been carried out. On the 8th of May, a car parked in a residential street, said the prosecutor, in Kentish Town, North London. On the 11th of May, she said, in relation to a residential property in Islington, and on the 12th of May, in relation to a residential property on the same street in Kentish Town, as where the car was parked that was a victim of that arson attack. And the prosecutor went on to say in court the car and both properties were linked to the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, but she added, at this stage, the alleged offending is unexplained. We know that one of those properties was a property at which Keir Starmer lived relatively recently, described as the family home, but currently rented out while he is Prime Minister. We did hear from the prosecutor as well that Lavronovich was interviewed under caution after his arrest and had initially denied arson, but there was no plea in this court hearing today. He was remanded in custody, and there will be another plea and trial preparation hearing on June the 6th.
Ollie, as you were just telling me, both properties had links to the British Prime Minister. How was this handled by the Met Police? And have we heard from Keir Starmer at all?
Well, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that they were investigating this via counter-terror officers. Now, that's because the links that emerged to such a high-profile public figure as Keir Starmer, in terms of what Keir Starmer himself has said about it, that has been fairly limited. When the police investigation became public, he thanked police for their work, but said that he couldn't say much more because there was a live investigation going on. On Wednesday, in Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons, the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, and the leader of the smaller opposition party, the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, both sent messages of support across the dispatch box to Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister described during that session what had happened as an attack on democracy, and thanked parliamentarians for the support that they were expressing for him. Clearly, this comes at a time when MPs are fearful for their security, for their safety. There have been 2 British MPs in recent years that have been murdered in and about their constituencies, and so security a very live and relevant issue for parliamentarians here in the UK, and that's one of the reasons I think that tributes were paid to the Prime Minister and support was showed to him during that PMQ session on Wednesday.
Ollie, and whilst we have you, MPs have been debating the assisted dying bill in Parliament today. What's the latest on this?
Well, where we are now is that the legislation that has been proposed came back to the House of Commons today for MPs to debate a series of proposed changes to it. Now, it was an emotional and passionate debate, as you might expect, with really strong arguments, powerful arguments being made on both sides. There was only a brief period of voting at the end of this long debate in Parliament. One of the changes that is being made to the proposed legislation is that it's being expanded, the number of people in terms of clarifications that would not be obliged to take part in any assisted death. It had initially in the legislation being clear that doctors and health practitioners wouldn't need to be involved if they didn't want to be, but effectively now that's been expanded to make sure that anyone involved in the process, social care workers, for example, pharmacists, would not have to be involved if they didn't want to. But this is just a stage in the process. It'll be the middle of June before we get to the point, at least it could be towards the end of June, that we see the overall legislation come to a vote in the House of Commons in terms of a yes or a no. And the legislation proposes that people who are terminally ill with less than 6 months to live under a certain set of conditions would be able to ask for assistance in ending their life. But as I say, we haven't yet got to that stage. We're still in the process looking at proposed changes and amendments to the legislation as it's currently proposed.
Ollie Barrett in London, thank you so much for joining us. A reminder of our top stories. Russia and Ukraine agreed to swap 1,000 prisoners of war as initial peace talks conclude in Istanbul. Local medics say at least 93 people have been killed in Gaza after Israeli airstrikes. And a man charged with arson on properties linked to the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer appears in court. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on X. GNT is coming up with Tom Burgess' Watson next, and we'll be back in a couple of hours with highlights of this week's W News Extra. Thank you so much for joining us and happy Friday.